Hi, this is Jennifer with A Crocheted Simplicity, and in this video tutorial I'll be teaching you how to crochet an easy textured short row hat. You may be thinking short rows, no way, that's too complicated for me, but please don't sell yourself short. We'll be using only basic crochet stitches with a simple stitch pattern repeat. I'll also show you how to use stitch markers to help make your project foolproof. I've designed several different hats using short rows as it's my favorite way to make a crochet hat. I love making short row hats for a couple different reasons. First, the short rows shape the crown and reduce the bulk in the hat. This gives the hat a much nicer, smoother fit. Secondly, you can adjust the circumference of your hat without having to start over. Because the hat is worked side to side from crown to hat band, you simply add more rows or work fewer rows, and you can easily just adjust the fit of the hat. Where top-down hats or bottom-up hats, you have to completely start over if you need to adjust the circumference. For my hat, for this video tutorial, I'm going to use Lion Brand Woolies. This color is Succulent. That's the color of this hat here. You're going to need a 5.5mm hook, a 5mm crochet hook, a pair of scissors, a yarn needle to weave in ends, and a handful of stitch markers, locking stitch markers. You can also use scraps of yarn if you'd like. So go ahead and gather your materials, and I'll meet you back here and we'll begin our hat. For purposes of this video tutorial, I'm going to be working with a shorter swatch, but go ahead and follow along in the written pattern and work your foundation chain for the size hat you're making. Begin with a slip knot on your hook. We're going to use a 5.5mm crochet hook for our foundation chain. I'm going to be chaining 25, so I have 24 total stitches. After you've completed your foundation chain, what it says in the pattern, switch to your 5mm hook. And for row 1, we're going to be working into both the back loops or back hump of the foundation chain. So if you turn your chain sideways, you can see these little ridges that stick up. That's what we refer to as the back hump. And then we're also going to be working into, some of the stitches will be into the front loop only. So you have your back hump here, and then this is the front loop. The first 8 stitches are worked into the back hump. These are the stitches in our crown. We're going to begin with a single crochet into the second chain from your hook. Make sure to work into the back hump of the chain. 1, 2, 3, we're going to work a total of 8 single crochet. 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now for the next section, the middle section is going to be the body of our hat. This is the textured stitch pattern. This is the section where we're going to be working into both the front loop only and the back hump. We're going to work a half double crochet into the front loop only of the next chain, and then a half double crochet into the back hump of the next chain. And that's as simple as our pattern repeat is. A half double crochet into the front loop only of the next chain, and then a half double crochet into the back hump of the next chain. Repeat that across as many times as your pattern tells you to. For this small swatch, I'm repeating it a total of 5 times, so I have 10 stitches in the body of my hat. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Now for the last 6 stitches of the row, we're going to work into the back hump only, work a half double crochet into each of the last 6 stitches. Now that's row 1 of your hat. Before we turn to begin row 2, place a stitch marker into the front loop only of that very first single crochet that you worked. This is going to be helpful. We're going to place a stitch marker into the front loop only of the first stitch of every odd number row as we go. After you place your stitch marker, go ahead and chain 1 and turn. Now we're going to work into the back loop only of the first 6 stitches. We're going to work a slip stitch. So work a slip stitch into the first 6 stitches. The slip stitches here help create the ridge that'll be part of your band. And then the repeat for the body of the hat, the center part, is the same as row 1, except for we're going to begin with a back loop only first. So work a half double crochet into the back loop only of the next stitch, and then work a half double crochet into the front loop only of the next stitch, and repeat that, half double crochet into the back loop only, and a half double crochet into the front loop only. Oops. Repeat that for as many times as the pattern states for the size you're making. Again, I'm working at a total of 5 times. And now we're going to work into the last few stitches of the row that are our crown. And the pattern tells us to work in the back loop only, work a slip stitch in each of the next 7 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now when you're working your slip stitches, one of the things, I know some people find slip stitches frustrating, you can go up a hook size if you need to, or you can just work them a little bit bigger than the stitch you're working into. What I mean by that, you want your slip stitches to be the same size as the tops of all your other stitches. And it's easy to work them a little tighter than most other stitches. So to increase the size, if you slightly pull up on the yarn that's on your hook before you work your slip stitch, that'll help ensure that the slip stitch is the right size. It can even be a little bit bigger than the stitch that you're working into. That's okay. We just don't want them smaller because it'll cause your hat to cinch. So after you've worked the last 7 slip stitches in the back loop only, that's it. We're going to skip the last stitch. You're not going to work into that. So we're going to chain 1 and turn, begin row 3, and row 3 is working the back loop only, work a single crochet into each of the first 7 stitches. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. We're going to place a stitch marker into the front loop only of the first stitch because this is an odd number row. Now we're going to work the stitch pattern for the body of our hat, and we're going to work a half double crochet in the front loop only and then a half double crochet in the back loop only. Repeat that across as many times as the pattern tells you to for the size you're making. Again, I'm only working at repeating it 5 times total. You can start to see the texture taking shape. And then we're going to end our row 3 with a half double crochet in the back loop of each remaining stitch. Now you can see the ridge that the back loop only slip stitches created at the beginning of row 2. You can see them a little bit better. So here's rows 1, 2, and 3. We're going to chain 1 and turn to work row 4. We're going to begin by working a slip stitch in each of the first 6 stitches. Remember to keep those slip stitches loose. They can be a little bit bigger if needed. Then we're going to work the stitches in the center portion of our hat. So we have a half double crochet into the back loop only, followed by a half double crochet into the front loop only. We're going to repeat that across for as many times as the pattern tells us to. And then we're going to end row 4 with a slip stitch in each of the next 6 stitches. And we're going to skip the last stitch. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then we skip this last stitch. You're going to chain 1 and turn. Now you can see these are our short rows, hence the name. So each row is going to get a little bit shorter than the next. So for row 5, we'd chain 1. We're going to work a single crochet into the back loop only of the first 5 stitches. Nope, I'm sorry, 6 stitches. And then we're going to work our stitch pattern repeat, which is half double crochet in the front loop only, half double crochet in the back loop only, we repeat that across the body of our hat for as many times as the pattern tells us to. And then we end the row with a half double crochet worked into the back loop only of each remaining stitch. And before we turn to begin the next row, we're going to place a stitch marker in the front loop only of the first single crochet of that row. Okay, to begin row 6, we're going to chain 1 and turn. Work a slip stitch in the back loop only of the first 6 stitches. And then we're going to work the textured portion of our hat. So work a half double crochet into the back loop only, and a half double crochet into the front loop only. Repeat that across as many times as the pattern tells you to. And then we're going to end row 6 with a slip stitch in the back loop only of the next 5 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Again, skipping that last stitch. And we chain 1 and turn to work row 7. At the beginning of row 7, we work in the back loops only. Work a single crochet in each of the first 5 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then we work our stitch pattern repeat, half double crochet into the front loop only of the next stitch, half double crochet into the back loop only of the next stitch. Repeat that across as many times as the pattern tells you. And then end the row with a half double crochet in the back loop only of each remaining stitch. Now, before we turn, place a stitch marker in the front loop only of the first single crochet of that row. And this is completed through row 6. Rows 7, 8, and 9 are simply doing the same thing. Each even number you're going to end with a skip stitch, and each row is going to get a little shorter. Don't forget to place your stitch markers. Go ahead and complete rows 7, 8, and 9, and I'll meet you back here and we'll work row 10 together. I misspoke a second ago. You needed to only complete rows 8 and 9, not 7, 8, and 9. We had just worked 7. So now that you've got rows 1 through 9 complete, we're going to work row 10. Row 10 is going to be worked across the row as we've done before, but instead of skipping a stitch, we're going to work into each of the unworked stitches from the previous rows. This is what creates our short row. It'll end up looking like a pie shape. So chain 1 and turn, work a slip stitch in the back loop only of the first 6 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then we're going to work our stitch pattern, which is a half double crochet in the back loop only, half double crochet in the front loop only. Repeat that for as many times as the pattern tells you. And then at the end of row 10, it says to work a back loop only slip stitch into each remaining stitch of the previous row and each unworked stitch all the way to row 1. So we're going to work in the back loop only, slip stitch in each stitch. Then we're going to jump down and slip stitch in the back loop only that's marked with the stitch marker. You can leave it in if you need to so you can see it easier. And remove it after you've worked the slip stitch. I like to remove them before. And then continue, work a slip stitch in the back loop only of this marked stitch. And then a slip stitch in the back loop only of this stitch. and then a slip stitch into the back loop only of that first stitch of row 1. And after you've completed row 10, this is what your work should look like. Here you can see all the different short rows, and they all come together to make a wedge or a pie shape. This is what gives the crown a really nice shape. So look at this on the right side of the fabric, and you can see the ridges from the back loop only slip stitches in the hat band and also in the crown where we worked them into the single crochet rows. Now I'm going to get you started with the next section of short rows. So we're going to work row 11, and then after that I'm going to have you complete the rest of the rows on your own, because then I've showed you everything you need to know. It's a pretty simple pattern. The only thing is each row here, every other row gets a little shorter. Then we work the last row of that section or that pie shape all the way down to that first section of the row, first row of the section. And after you've done that, we've worked all of our different sections, then we're going to seam the hat. I'm going to show you. So this hat I didn't seam yet, so I can show you on camera. You can see the different pie shape sections. Let's see if I can. So we have one pie shape section here, and then this is the beginning of our next one, and then you can see where the next one ends here, and then our next pie shape section here, and then finally our last pie shape section. And when you put them all together, it kind of looks like a spiral in the crown. So now we're going to work row 11. A common question that I receive with row 11, or the first row after we've worked the last row of a section, finish up the short rows, is now where do I work my stitches? Do I work in the bottom of the foundation chain? No. You're going to, just like you normally do, you chain one and turn, and then we're going to work into the stitches from the last row. So our stitches from the last row are here. They follow the shape of the crown. We're going to begin with a single crochet in the back loop only of the first 8 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Don't forget to place a stitch marker in the front loop only of that first single crochet, because this will mark where you need to finish off the next section of short rows. And we're going to work our textured stitch pattern, half double crochet in the front loop, half double crochet in the back loop, and then end the row with a half double crochet in the back loop of each remaining stitch. Now your row 12 is simply a repeat of row 2. So 12 through 19 is going to repeat rows 2 through 9. And when you get to your next row 2 is going to leave this last stitch unworked. So then you're going to work 7 single crochet, and it's going to go back and forth, back and forth. Make sure you remember to place your stitch marker in the front loop only of each odd numbered row. That will help you a lot when you're working the row 20 to finish up your next row of, or next section of short rows. So go ahead and complete rows 12 through 19, which is a repeat of 2 through 9, And I'll meet you back here and we'll complete row 20, and then I will show you how to seam your hat. Now that I've completed through row 19, I'm ready to work row 20, which is going to end another short row section. So we're going to work along the previous row, row 19, and then into each unworked stitch to row 11. We don't go all the way back to row 1, we stop at row 11. This is where the stitch markers come in handy. So we're going to chain 1 and turn. Work a slip stitch into each of the first 6 stitches in the back loop only. Work our stitch pattern across, half double crochet in the back loop only, half double crochet in the front loop only. And then we're going to work a slip stitch in the back loop of each of the last 4 stitches of that row. And then we're going to work a slip stitch in the back loop only of each of the unworked stitches to row 11. I'm going to remove all of the stitch markers except for the one that I placed in row 11. Now if you look at your hat, you can see the little stair steps where you skip those stitches. You're going to work in the back loop only of each of those skipped stitches. Work a slip stitch into each of those skipped stitches. And then lastly, row 11. And that completes our second section of short rows. You can see how much our hat, the crown of our hat, is curving and taking shape. It lays really nice and flat on the top of your head. Now quickly, I'm going to show you a tip that I use if you lose track of what row you're on. The easiest way I've found when you're using slip stitches, they come in handy for counting rows because every ridge is 2 rows. So here's our first row, that's our second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So I just count by 2s. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, which lines up because that completed our first section of short rows. Then 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, here's another section. Or you could go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. But that's a simple, quick way to count your rows when you're working the short rows. So go ahead and complete your hat for the size you're making. Fasten off and leave a tail that's at least 2.5 times the length of your hat. So for this one, I'd probably want a tail of about 15 to 18 inches. Once you've completed all of the rows of your hat, fastened off and left a tail, meet me back here and we will seam the hat. Now that you've completed all the rows in your hat and you've fastened off and left a tail of yarn 2.5 to 3 times the length of your hat, I'm going to show you how to seam your hat. We're going to work a simple whip stitch, but we're going to work in certain loops. So go ahead and bring the first row up to meet the last row you worked. This is the last row I worked, and you can see where the tail is that I fastened off. With the right side of your hat facing out. The right side of your hat, you're going to be able to see the ridges from the crown and the hat band. Now line up your stitches from the first and the last rows. I'm going to zoom in. And we're going to be working into the both loops, back loops, front loops, depending on where you're working. So for the first 8 stitches in our crown, we're going to whip stitch the back loop only of this first row. We're going to work the back loop only to both loops from, I misspoke, the back loop only of the last row here, that's in the front, to both loops of the first row that's in the back. So we have both loops from the first row to the back loop only of the last row. Again, both loops of that first row to the back loop only of the last row. If it's easier to think of, it's both loops of the row that's furthest from you, back loop only of the row that's closest to you. I like to work a few and then tighten up my whip stitch. You do this into the first 8 stitches. So now that I've worked that many, I'm going to tug gently to tighten that up. And we're going to work a total of 8. To each single crochet. Okay, now for the body of the hat, this one's a little trickier. We're going to be working into the front loop only of the stitches from the last row you worked, or the row that's closest to you, and then both stitches of the first row, the row that's furthest away. And then the next one, we're going to work in the back loop only of the row closest to you, your last row, and both loops of that first row. So we're just going to alternate just how we worked our half double crochets in the front loop or back loop. We're going to do the same with our whip stitches. So we're going to begin with a whip stitch worked into both loops of the back row or first row and front loop only of the last row. And then our next one is going to be both loops of the back row, back loop of the front row. And then we have both loops of the back row, front loop of the front row. Alternate across, so we have both loops of the back row, back loop of the front row. Work a few stitches, pull your yarn to make sure it's tight, tighten up the seam. And then work both loops of the back row, front loop of the front row, and both loops of the back row, back loop of the front row. Both loops of the back row, front loop of the front row, and you continue seaming like this, alternating the front loop and the back loop all across the body of the hat. And once you get to the band, we're going to work it a little different. It's a little more tedious working into the different loops, but once you see how invisible the seam is, you're going to be glad you did it. And for the last few stitches of the row, we're going to be working into the back loop only of the row closest to you, and both loops of the row furthest away from you. So both loops of the row in the back loop of the row closest to you. And then after you've whip stitch and every stitch across and tugged to make sure your seam was tight, you can go ahead and weave in your ends. Now you can see that you can't really tell where that seam is. A little bit down here, but it's pretty invisible, which is great. So then we're going to take care of the crown. You're going to have a little gap in the crown. Just use a yarn needle and a tail of yarn and weave in and out of all the stitches or the rows of your crown. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just in and out of all of them, and then pull your ends to tighten and close the crown. And once you've closed your crown, fasten off that yarn on the inside of your hat. I like to double knot mine and then weave in my ends. And then that's it, and your hat is complete. And you can add a tag or a pom-pom, whatever you like, to make your hat your own. I hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and I hope you've enjoyed this pattern and realize that short rows aren't really that hard. They're simple, and with a couple little tricks like using the stitch markers, they help keep you on track so you don't lose your stitches. If you love the way the short rows work for the crown, you'll have to check out my blog and my Ravelry and Etsy shops. I have several other hats that use short rows that I think you'll love as well. If you have any questions, you can feel free to use the contact form on my blog or email me at www.acrochetedsimplicity.com. Thanks for watching my video, and have a great day.